Good to go.
Thank you, Brian. All right, let's begin with a roll call.
Sure. Ms. Sapone,
Marcella, you're muted.
maybe she stepped away for a second. Ms. Wells,
Here.
Mr. Witherspoon,
Here.
Mr. Cantor,
Here.
Mr. Rowena, Richard, you muted or you?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Schulman,
Here.
and we can note Ms. Sapone when she comes back in.
Okay. Excuse me. The first item on the agenda under review and action on new applications is 2021-35 CAM, Bruce and Karen Bruchac, 51 Seaview Avenue, conversion of existing single-family residence to a two-family residence. And I see that the Bruchacs are with us. Would you like to present this? If so, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
You want to talk?
I'm Bruce, and this is my wife, Karen. Our proposed project is to turn the house at 51 Seaview Avenue, Norwalk, from a one-family residence into a two-family residence. The house was purchased in 1979 as a two-family residence. Sometime in the early 1990s, we turned the house into a single-family home. We are now seeking to convert it back to a two-family residence. There will be no changes to the footprint of the house or the existing conditions of the property. Storm runoff is handled by a 2-by-3-foot catch basin at the base of the driveway, as well as the catch basin across the street on Osborne Avenue, and 2 curb drains across the street on Seaview Avenue. All drains are the property of City of Norwalk. Water services, sewage, and refuse collection are handled by the City of Norwalk. Power is supplied by Third Taxing District. The first floor elevation of the house is at 21.9 feet. And the proposed project will have no adverse impact to the existing aquatic coastal resources.
Thank you. This is pretty straightforward. The only reason we're hearing it is because it's in a flood zone, but as you heard from Mr. Bruchac, the house is at elevation 21, well above what would be required if this was a new building. So Steve, we do have a statement on this that we need to approve. Can you pull that up for the commission?
There you go. Do you need me to blow that up at all?
It's fine with me. Can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Okay, Michael has made the motion. Is there a second? Richard seconded, even though he was muted, and Galen seconded it as well. Any questions for the staff or the Bruchacs? All right, if not, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Marcella, all those opposed? Any abstentions? All right, it's approved unanimously. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Here.
All right, next item, review and action on pending applications.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. The Norwalk Housing Authority Colonial Village, they're looking for an extension of time for the previously approved multifamily development. Adam, would you like to explain? You are currently muted. There you go.
I am happy to explain, although I do have Attorney Suchi here to represent us. Is it okay if she starts?
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Pavilski. Good evening, everyone. For the record, I'm Liz Suchi of Carmody, Torrance, Sandak, and Hennessy. And as you know, Mr. Pavilski is the Executive Director of the Housing Authority. We are before you for an extension of time on an application number 8-20 SP that you approved last year, and that involved the 18 new buildings comprising 69 units at 164 West Cedar, the property that is adjacent to the existing Colonial Village, which many of you, if you've driven by, have seen the renovations that are underway. The approval was effective November 10th, and there is a one-year provision in your zoning regulations that an applicant is obligated to get zoning and building permits within that 1 year, or the underlying approval is automatically null and void, unless we secure an extension of time from this agency. We are here before you for that very purpose. Several things have happened in the past year. The certificate of special permit has been recorded, 2 Mylars have been recorded. The Office of State Traffic Administration determined that operations will not be substantially affected by this development, and we recorded the administrative decision in January as is required. So far, a development partner has been selected, and that agreement with that development partner is under negotiation. And just as of earlier this month and last month and into August, we've received solar panel installation proposals, and those are being evaluated for incorporation into the project. But November 10th is rapidly approaching, and all of these component parts will not be achieved by that date. So we thought it prudent to come before you and seek this extension of time for 1 year. The $1,000 fee has been paid, and everything else that is ongoing with the property and its improvements to the existing buildings is underway. If you have any other questions of me or Mr. Pavilski, we'd be happy to answer them.
I think, again, this is a pretty straightforward request from the applicant. I have no questions. Do any other members of the commission have questions? Okay, I would ask, however, that as you begin to move forward, if you would please keep us appraised of where the possibility of solar panels stands, since the commission expressed some interest in that. All right, we have before us a draft resolution to approve the extension. Is there a motion to approve?
So
I'll
moved.
move the motion.
Okay, Michael moved. Richard, can I take that as a second?
You may.
Okay, and Richard seconds. Steve, question for you. I could be wrong, but I don't think that Marcella was involved in the approval of this project. The question is she eligible to vote on the extension?
Yeah, I don't see an issue with that as long as she's comfortable with what she's voting on. There's no issue there.
Okay, that's fine. All right, we have a motion that's been approved and seconded. Any questions for the applicant? All right, if not, let's do this one by a roll call.
Okay, Mr. Witherspoon,
Yes.
Mr. Cantor,
Yes.
Miss Wells,
Yes.
Miss Sapone,
Yes.
Mr. Rowena,
Yes.
and Mr. Schulman.
Yes,
Okay, that's unanimous.
Thank you,
okay,
everyone, for your time. Appreciate it very much.
thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Okay. David wasted no time in coming online.
You guys are being very efficient tonight.
I think we're going to move a little more slowly on this next item. That is 2021-33 Merit Station, Norwalk, LLC, 67, 69, 79, 87, 111, 117, 129, 135, 155, 156, and 201 Glover Avenue, and 2 Oakwood Avenue, the North 7 project. I believe that this is just an update and a discussion among ourselves and with Attorney Waters on where things stand. So Attorney Waters, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, David Waters, General Counsel of Building and Land Technology, applicant in all of these applications. What I think that we had talked about and what I planned on speaking about tonight is the third leg of the applications. We've talked about the zone changes that are required, and we've talked about the master plan, and we're still talking about the master plan that we're proposing. But what we have not revisited for a while is the actual text amendment that would allow for approval of a master plan. And we have been working with your staff on a back and forth basis of language that would be acceptable in order to allow for the approval of a master plan. So if you don't mind, I will I'll share my screen. And I believe, Steve, have you provided the text amendment that we had gone back and forth on?
Yeah, I sent them the marked up version so they could just see our comments on that.
Perfect.
So they have it.
Perfect. So I'm going to go through that with you and just kind of give my comments and thoughts, and hopefully we can get some feedback to make sure that we're all on the same page. I know there were a couple of things that Steve and I have discussed, which we thought that it would be best to actually get some feedback from the commission so that we can put all of this together. The goal would be that once we have the concepts and language pretty much nailed down, then we can clean up the actual text itself and put it into a presentable form so that it will be usable for a public hearing. So without further ado, I'm going to just kind of go through the amendments, the draft back and forth that we had. The first aspect of it is the definition of a development park. Norwalk currently has a definition of a development park, and the original concept was that it was for office and accessory uses. We are now proposing that be changed to that it's a variety of uses that are permitted in the underlying zone. We've worked with staff and we agree that on most of it, the question is when it says containing a mix of uses, or should it just say containing uses allowed in the underlying zone? Two thoughts on this from our perspective. One of them is that in approving a master plan, you will decide whether there is a mix of uses and whether it's an acceptable mix of uses or not. So it really doesn't need to be specified here. I have a bigger concern that because development parks as a definition currently exist, and development parks themselves do exist, one being Merit 7, one being the Towers, and one being 800 Connecticut Avenue, that to say a mix of uses, I don't know that there is a mix of uses, for example, at Connecticut Avenue. So I'm a little concerned that we might actually make something non-conforming by specifying that. But frankly, I don't really, from my perspective, I don't particularly care if the commission felt that it was important to specify that. From our perspective, it is fine, but I just raised the question. So that is the first of the items. The second set of items that was in the document that was provided to you had to do with affordable housing, the workforce housing regulations. That's actually now moot because you have, since the time that we made the application, you have revised your regulations to state that any multifamily development, and it didn't actually specify what zones it had to be in, would have to have the workforce housing units in it. So all of the provisions that had been proposed as to including executive office within that language is no longer necessary. So we can just move on from there. I'm going to skip for a minute the next provision, which had to do with the site plan piece of it, and move to the special permit piece within the executive office zone, because I think it'll make more sense if we can do that first. What we have proposed collectively is that within the executive office zone, by special permit, a development park would be permitted. And we then go on to say what that application would at a minimum contain. It would contain an A2 survey. It would contain site development plans showing location of buildings, streets, lighting, walkways, open space, natural features, and signage. That is being added in as part of that. A preliminary traffic analysis, preliminary drainage analysis, initial table indicating compliance with the height and bulk standards for each of the structures, architectural renderings and elevations depicting the bulk and height of the buildings, and an architectural and site design manual that would be prepared in consultation with the peer review consultant. So those are the things that at a minimum we would need to provide. Of course, the commission has the ability to require other documentation as well. And in fact, we have provided some documentation that is not part of this list, but it would at least give you the minimum of what would be required. And we think that we've already provided that. So unless there's something else that you would like added to this list, this would be, again, the minimum, and the commission always has the right to request something more. The next piece, the next discussion point is actually one where we have had some discussion with staff, and that is that staff had proposed this language which states that there be a minimum of 3 distinct uses and residential can occupy no more than 75% of the development park. We feel that that's really not a necessary statement here, because again, the commission will be approving a site or a development plan. And so as a result, the commission will either agree that the number of uses and the mix of uses and the intensity of uses is acceptable, or they will decide that it isn't, in which case they won't approve the plan. So I don't think that it's necessary to, first of all, to include a stipulation as to the 3 uses and 75%. Frankly, I think it shackles both the commission and us as the applicant, because you're now requiring something that's purely artificial. So we don't believe that that's an appropriate stipulation, because you do have the ultimate control anyway, that if you don't like the mix of uses and you don't like the proportion of uses, you're just not going to approve the plan to begin with. But beyond that, I think it's a bit myopic to talk about the plan and say that 75% or whatever it may be has to be of a certain type, or no more than 75% is a certain type, and that you have to have a mix of uses, because the development park is what you see dashed in yellow here. But in reality, what we're talking about is a much larger area that this is a piece of. You have all of Merit 7 and all of the towers that are part of this microcosm that we are developing and has been developed. And between Merit 7 and the towers, you have 2 million square feet of office space. So to artificially say that the development park should be limited to a certain type of use or a certain percentage of use, when right across the street, you have 100% office use over here and 100% office use down here, it just seems a little bit myopic to be focusing on just that area, when in fact we have a somewhat larger area that is a well-defined neighborhood for this project.
David, I don't disagree with what you're saying about your development. However, the other thing we have to keep in the forefront is that this is language for any development park, not just the one that you're proposing.
Agreed, but again, Mr. Schulman, if you'll remember that this is language that is specific to the executive office zone. And currently, the only property that is within the executive office zone besides this property is the property that is now developed as the curb up here, all of Merit 7, which is fully developed, and the towers, which is also developed. So the likelihood that there would be a different development park that is proposed, which again requires 10 acres, is highly unlikely unless you change some other zone to allow more executive office zone.
Excuse
Well,
me.
I could possibly see something like that happening for example on the old Norden site, where you may have the requisite acreage. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, but I think we have to keep that in mind, that we're not just talking about your project here. We're talking
Agreed.
about any other project of scale like this.
But only in the executive office zone. Isn't that's
Right.
the rub of
That's
this
correct.
point, right? Because the Norden is not in the executive office zone. That's
No,
a
it's not.
B2, right? Okay. And
So,
we still get the points to, if I remember correctly, the approval of the master plan is step one, and approval of, actual buildings and construction and whatnot is another check on the whole project. So even approval of the master plan is almost, I don't want to say perfunctory, that's too strong of a word, but sort of like it's an indicative yes to the project and gets things going, but is not we still have, it seems, if I remember correctly, a couple of checkpoints along the way to make sure it's developing in the way that we want it to.
Yes, absolutely.
That's okay, cool.
Yeah.
Sorry, Galen,
I don't have an issue with removing that language per se. My only kind of question / concern would be, once the master plan is approved, I don't know if you have the ability to deny, say they wanted to develop the entire site as residential, all the building. I don't know how you would tell them no, provided, all the traffic works and all those things. But I don't know if you have much say over the uses after the master plan is approved.
well, the uses are stipulated in the plans themselves that are approved as the master plan. If there's a change that is to be made to those, it would have to come back to the commission for an amendment to that master plan.
But don't you have the buildings like unless I'm just completely misremembering? I thought the building pad sites were all residential towers.
Or they
could be something else, I guess, too.
No, and they have, but they also have retail within them in some of them as well. But yes, everything is currently stipulated as being residential other than the retail space. And as we had said, that there's flexibility that is there that you could plug and play. If you had we should all wish, but if you had an Oracle that said that they wanted to have their headquarters on Glover Avenue, we could easily convert one of the buildings into a headquarters. It would require us to come back to the commission at that point because it's a change from what was being proposed and approved. But there is flexibility that is built in there, and we've specifically talked about either a headquarters building or a hotel building or something of the sort like that, that we would have the ability, but again, it's subject to commission review and approval.
David, I just have a question to ask you. If there were no guidelines, which gives you the flexibility to present and us the flexibility to approve or not, I mean, what would your legal feeling be if we all decided that we just didn't like it?
Well, right now, it's entirely within your control, because in order for us to do this, in order to get an approval, you're acting in a legislative capacity, because you're approving a zone change and you're approving text. And when you're acting in that capacity, you have unfettered discretion, as long as it's not for some truly unreasonable or heinous reason. Like we don't want poor people or something of the sort like that. But beyond that, understood that you hold the marbles at this point. There's no question.
Well, on this part that we're talking about now, but I'm saying if we went along with your proposal, that the text amendment that you're proposing has no guidelines in it, just a mix in accordance with the new master plan, then what's the criteria that we use in terms of making a decision? It would sound like we could do whatever we want, which we know is not the case.
Well, within reason, that's true. But again, I think that the point is that by making this application, this set of applications together, we've offered you the ability to do that, whether you would otherwise have the ability or not. Because again, if you don't like the master plan that we've proposed, all you have to do is say, we're not going to approve the text. And then there's no way that the master plan can be approved. So we've offered you that ability to basically have unfettered review of this and unfettered discretion. Once you've adopted the text, then you would look at it. And again, we've stated, we just went through kind of the things that we would need to provide, which we have provided, to describe what the plan would have to have. And you would then have to decide whether that's in conformity with the plan of conservation and development. And if it's something that you feel is supportive of the nature and the intent of the executive office zone and the zoning regulations.
So you're basically saying that at the end of the day, when all of these discussions are finished and the master plan is finished, there's going to be enough information for us to make a decision, even though we have no guideline in the regulation.
Yes, that what you will have, and we've been providing you over time, is everything from the mix of uses and the kind of bulk and location of buildings to the economic impact. If you remember back a year or so ago, we provided you with an economic impact study, and we've provided you with drainage, and we've provided you with a variety of other pieces to all of this, and parking and traffic, so that you will have an ability to determine whether this actually is consistent with the plan of conservation and development or not.
Okay, thank you.
The next set of pieces in all of this, there was a portion that was crossed out, which deals with signage manual, and that's because we addressed it up above, that will be part of the overall plan. Staff had then put in 4 of your criteria, one dealing with residential density, one dealing with height, FAR, and recreation area. And my question was, I don't think you need that language here, because it's also in the schedule of height and bulk of buildings. So you're just repeating it twice. I think Steve and I had agreed that it could be in one place or the other, but it doesn't need to be in both. So I think, again, that's just a question of style. But given the fact that the height and bulk of buildings schedule does include all of these things for every other zone, it's probably the appropriate place to put it. And we'll get into the specifics of all of that in just a minute when we get to the height and bulk of buildings. The next one is kind of a hybrid. Our point would be, again, that on the open space, the 30% open space is already stipulated in the height and bulk of buildings. So it limits us to, it requires at least 30% of the total acreage shall be open space. So I don't think that that piece of it specifically needs to be here. What we do agree is that what we have offered and the commission has required, we had proposed that a minimum of 20% of the overall site will be publicly available open space. So to that extent, that should be in this location, because it's different from the general statement of what's covered by buildings and parking and what's open space, which is the reciprocal of that. And we do agree that there would be an easement placed on the land records to ensure that it is maintained as public open space. I questioned with Steve whether that should be the Conservation Commission or the zoning. I don't really care who does it. That will leave to you to decide. So from our perspective, on a stylistic basis, we don't think that the 30% statement needs to be located here, but we do agree that the 20% public open space statement and requirement does need to be stated here, and that the statement that there will be an easement placed on the land records to be held by somebody in the city should also be here as well. The next set, we've had some discussion on prior meetings about green development techniques. And these were a list that were provided to us by your staff as suggested as appropriate, and we've agreed to them. So we agree that all buildings will provide either green roofs, blue roofs, contain solar panels, or be solar ready for the portions of the roofs that are not being used for recreation area improvements. There will certainly be areas of these buildings that will be used. There often is a pool on the top deck or landscaped areas that are part of the open space or what have you. But to the extent that they are not being used for those uses, then the rest of the surfaces will in fact be green roof, blue roof, solar panels, or solar ready. We've agreed that the surface water will be handled through on-site retention and to use rain gardens and bioswales where feasible. We've certainly agreed to electric vehicle charging stations. Frankly, we're putting those in anyway. And we already have put in and will be continuing to put in sheltered bike parking. And we've agreed that landscaping will be native species, except perimeters that may contain other species as approved by the commission. Again, the specifics of those types of plantings would be part of the individual site plan review for each building as it is proposed. So you'll get that chance to review and approve all of that.
What does it mean when we, oh, go ahead, Gavin.
No, I just had one question about whether or not there should be a certain percentage of the roofs that must be solar ready, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that you couldn't, or somebody wouldn't move all of their recreational area out to the roofs, and then suddenly there's not much space left for solar panels or for any of the other environmental fixes.
I'm a bit careful about that because of the fact that if you think about the roofs for these buildings, there's the roof on top of the used portion of it, the apartments or whatever they may be. And then there's the roofs that are on top of the parking decks. And the roofs that are on top of the parking decks are usually at a plaza level that is in fact used by almost 100% by the residents for barbecue pits, swimming pools, at the curb, for example, in Building A, that entire inside of the donut is swimming, barbecue, lounge areas. The entire area within the donut in Building B is kind of a Zen garden with barbecuing as well. So I mean, there's a significant amount of it that in fact will be used for residential recreational area.
Easy to make a distinction between roofs on the plaza level and roofs on the, above the third story, fourth story, fifth story. I mean,
Sure, and that's a fair point. That's a fair point. We could certainly look at that. I suspect that there may be some terraces that are up on the top of the buildings, but I don't think that it would be a significant percentage. So we could probably agree to commit to some percentage, a minimum percentage, whatever that minimum is, that must be green roof, blue roof, solar, or solar ready.
Why don't you have that conversation with staff?
Yeah, I will.
Okay, thank
we
you.
will. I'm just making a note on that.
David, when you say solar ready, what do you mean by that?
That's a good question. Your staff is the one that provided that language, so I'll ask them what specifically they were talking about. I could tell you that we have here at our office at 1 Elmcroft in Stamford, we have one of the largest solar fields on the roof of any building in Connecticut. And we put it there. So we're not averse to the concept of solar panels by any means.
Yeah, if I
Yeah.
recall correctly, it's been a long time since this language was initially crafted. I think that it was probably something to do with a past conversation about the economic feasibility of doing solar at that time. So we put that caveat in there. So to make sure that if and when the cost or technology was appropriate, that it could be carried out. But I mean, I'm happy if you want to remove that particular part of the language as well.
I would be in favor of removing it. These buildings are so unencumbered from a height side. It's not like there are trees blocking and shading and whatnot. So,
I agree.
and along with Galen's points, I think that marries to something that has some teeth and some merit to it that I think is a really interesting angle.
We'll talk with your staff and try and figure out what we can work through on this as far as percentages and what have you. That's fine. Is there anything else that is not in there that the commissioners feel should be stated in there at this point? Again, remembering that you will get another bite at the apple with individual development, but knowing that we're again making a commitment on an overall basis here.
David, are you asking about items 2 through 6, or you're going all the way down to 10 here?
No, Mr. Chairman, actually what I was talking about was specifically this whole green development concept, that if there was anything that needed to be done there. The next segment of the regulations is actually an interesting one from our perspective, and we think that it works very well, and it actually is a concept that we used here in Stamford, and that is that individual parcels, because when we do this development, we will be obviously carving it up into individual land parcels, because that makes sense from a financing standpoint and from a development standpoint and ownership. But that being said, it may turn out that it's not perfect as it relates to things like FAR, density, coverage, the minimum parking and open space. That there may be, for example, based upon where the line is drawn, that an individual parcel may not have all of the that the residential density is higher than would be otherwise permitted for that individual parcel. But as long as the overall development meets the criteria, then that wouldn't be a problem. And this is actually was used, I believe, at Merit 7 as well, with a kind of a transfer of FAR rights. So the same thing would be true here, which would allow for flexibility just for the purpose of drawing property lines. But again, all of these properties are joined at the hip, and therefore they would all have to still comply with the overall FAR, density, building coverage, things like that.
Do we run into any? Oh, go ahead, Lou.
I was going to say that I have some potential problem with that. Since we're going to be approving these most likely as individual projects. For example, let's say your first building doesn't have sufficient parking, and that's as far as the project ever goes. Well, then we've got a building that doesn't have sufficient parking. And I'm concerned about, I'm a little less concerned about perhaps the FAR, but I am concerned about some of those other items like open space, for example. Again, if we approve one or two buildings going forward, and let's say that CONDOT never comes forward with the promised road improvements, and as a result, the other buildings don't go forward, we could be in a very awkward position. That is the city, and you as well, with basically non-conforming buildings.
I have a suggestion for that. We could say that they can trade these things between buildings, but only buildings that are approved together. So if two buildings are approved at the same time, the parking could be adjusted between the two of them because they've both been approved together. So we know between those two buildings, you have sufficient parking. The same with open space, et cetera, but you can't say, I'm going to build this building with insufficient parking, but then that building over there that hasn't been approved yet, hasn't even been proposed yet, is the one that's going to have the parking. Do you see what I mean?
And I understand that, Galen, as well. But if you look at the three projects they've already put up on the other side of the street, if one of those projects was dependent for parking, excuse me, on one of the other projects, that's a pretty darn far way to go to park your car.
We don't approve it. I mean, if it's
Right.
not, we don't approve it. If they say, well, our parking is going to be over there, it's just a half a mile, then we say, well, no. This doesn't make any sense.
I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that as far as distance on parking, you already have a provision in the code that requires that any off-site parking has to be within a certain distance anyway. And that would certainly be a good basis for saying that if you can't, and I agree with you completely that it's not the intent to be able to say, gee, we can build a building without any parking whatsoever, or a limited amount of parking, and we'll worry about it later, because that doesn't help us either. But I completely understand your comment. I think that the idea here is to allow for the flexibility, and as Commissioner Wells has pointed out, I think that it's really a question of trading, and we can make it so that it has to be something that is ascertainable and is verifiable and can be done in a way that it's not just a wish to be done in the future. One of the reasons, actually, frankly, behind all of this is because we know that a lot of the enhanced open space, which you've been looking for and we've been willing to provide, is the area up around Raccoon Brook. Rather than providing little areas of open space that really aren't significant among themselves, we really wanted to create that area that is a public area. So you, as a result, you are kind of pushing a lot of the open space into a single area, as opposed to where you would normally have it running through a variety of other buildings. So that's part of the reason for the flexibility. Part of it is that it just makes more sense, for example, that building 1.2, which is the building that's just north of the square, does not have parking itself, because that parking will be found either at the garage at 1.1, or it'll be found at 2.1, which is just to the north of it. So again, part of that can be done through the long-term instrument that is for parking that's within a certain distance of the use of the property. But we felt that it was easier and better to just be clear about it, and that's why we did this.
Steve, I think if we're being asked to approve this, there ought to be language in it that makes absolutely clear that these things are entirely at the discretion of the commission, so that we have a very firm hand when it comes to approving these. Even though it may be implied in the language, it seems to me it should be stated overtly.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any problem at all with that.
Okay.
Sure, and I'll think about that a little bit more and work with Attorney Waters on something, and we could always forward that back out for you for comments.
Okay, that sounds good.
What would happen if you sold one of the parcels that was horse trading with each other?
Yep. So what happens with that, Mr. Cantor, is that there will be, and we've done this again down here in Stamford, there will be either a form of planned community that's required, or a REA restrictions and agreements that would be recorded. And the whole point of that is to make sure that one property owner doesn't go rogue and take everything from everybody else. So for the very reason that you're suggesting, there will be a governing document that will have to be created that will enforce that. Because otherwise, theoretically,
yeah, it's like you dump everything on one property that you don't like, you dump that property, and all of a sudden everything's hunky dory everywhere else.
Or we sell a piece off to an investor, and the investor decides that, gee, wouldn't it be nice to put another 2 floors on this building and take up the residential units that otherwise were intended for someplace else.
Yeah, exactly.
So absolutely agreed. And as I said, it's worked very well down here in Stamford with Harbor Point and Yale and Town.
Yeah, it conceptually makes a lot of sense with the large area to be able to get that nice park area with first a lot of small little dinky little pocket parks. There's here's a real chunk of land. Exactly.
The next piece is just a reference to the fact that we are required to provide workforce housing, which we absolutely agree is a requirement, so that we can move on from that. And then the last piece in this particular thing was actually some language that I drafted and didn't draft particularly well. And Steve and I went back and forth, but I think that it makes sense now if you look at my margin note, which is to basically say that once a special permit has been issued for a master plan, any development of the property within that development park area has to conform to the special permit for the master plan, including all of the documents that are submitted, the uses, the heightened bulk, all of the rest of that stuff, plus the site plan review application requirements as well. So you're not just creating a theoretical master plan, but you're putting the hooks into it that say, once it's approved, we, the commission, can insist that everything has to comply with it.
Is that in perpetuity regardless of owner? Or how would that work? Okay.
Yes, no, it is absolutely in perpetuity regardless of owner. And the only way that you could change that, again, would be by coming back to the commission and saying, I would like to change the master plan, and this is how I'd like to change it. So then if we take that, now we can go back to the language that was had to do with site plan in the executive office zone. And the proposed language that we've put in here says that you're allowed under site plan review developments approved as part of a development park master plan, provided that the development is in accordance with the master plan, that the site and building design is consistent with the design manual as verified by the peer review consultant. That again, and this goes back to the question on how do we know what the FAR or this parking or the open space or whatever it is, that there has to be a table indicating compliance with the master plan, including bulk and height standards. So every time you come in, you'll get another time to check it and make sure that everybody's within the envelope. And lastly, that it has to comply with all of your usual standards for site plan review. And then I have put down here, just so that you'll recall what those are, but I'm sure you do anyway. It's again, the stable traffic flow, off-street parking and loading, landscaping and screening, illumination, utilities, and impact on adjacent properties, and no zoning violations. So those are in any site plan application, you would have those opportunities to review those things. But in addition to that, the application for site plan review for any of the buildings within this master plan, once approved by special permit, must comply with the master plan itself.
Oh, interesting. So effectively what we're saying, and Steve, correct me here, is the project as a whole gets approved by special permit. Individual parcels are now site plan review. Site plan review, the commission has less ability to influence via site plan review versus special permit. Do I have that right, Steve?
Correct, yeah, so that the idea
So
is,
effectively, you're handing over some significant, I don't know what's the right word, power, I guess. That's the only word I got right now in doing it this way.
yeah, so that's the idea, that before you approve the master plan, you better be very comfortable with the master plan and all the components of the master plan.
Because you're no longer, if we go look at this, you no longer have use as a, right? Use is not a criteria for site plan approval.
Right.
Right, so now we're back at, so this is where Lou's point of 75% residential, which I honestly, I don't particularly like for the reasons you said, David, but we've lost the power in this, the way that this is written, to have we couldn't reject. So the way that this is written, if I'm interpreting correctly, we approve the master plan. Woohoo! It looks beautiful. You come in with the building now that's 100% commercial or 100 whatever, something that we don't like. Use is no longer on the table. The way that this is written.
If it is consistent with the master plan. Now, if we came in with something, if we came in with a building that said we want to now put a Costco on Glover Avenue instead of building 3.1, that would not be acceptable, and you would reject it out of hand, unless we also came in and said we'd like an amendment to the master plan to allow us to do that, and you said, okay, you can do it.
Gotcha. Okay.
The concept, Commissioner Cantor, is that, and this goes back a year and a half to when we first started. I realized that but part of it is that it's a significant investment by us
Totally.
in this entire project, in doing the infrastructure and doing everything. And so we need to know, and we think that the city should know that there's some certainty in what you're going to get as a result of that, and that we know where the guide rails are at that point.
And we go back to the section that sort of highlights what we're going to get from the master plan approval.
Sure.
I'm following along too, which is another section.
So the things that that must be
Gotcha, here we
submitted
go.
at a minimum are the survey of the area, obviously, a site development plan that shows the locations of proposed buildings, streets, anticipated lighting, walkways, open
Yep.
space, natural features, signage, the
But
traffic
nothing about
analysis.
nothing about use here. Am I right?
Actually, a good question. It should actually state that, and that's a valid point. It should actually include the uses.
Okay.
Proposed uses.
I'm less concerned if that's enumerated here in some way that
Mhm.
makes sense with staff. And Steve, you feel like there's enough weight to that?
Steve, to Nick's point, I mean, assuming we can come to agreement on the language, is the staff comfortable with giving up some of that authority in order to have the master plan?
Yeah, I think that's why we've been stressing that you've got to be very comfortable with that master plan and what that is. So that's why we've been trying to
Okay.
get as much of that detail agreed upon upfront as possible. And I mean, I think for the uses, I think we'd start with what's allowed in the executive office zone and see if there's something in there that is something we don't think is appropriate, or is there something missing that's out of there? I think the kind of trend we've been going in is kind of laying out the uses in a much more permissive fashion without trying to micromanage that. So I think just as long as there's not something in there that's particularly noxious or something that's going to not fit in with the area, obviously that's not something that the applicant's probably interested in either. So I think that should be a pretty easy exercise.
As a frame of reference to the commission, the Merit 7, there was an informal master plan. It kind of got trotted out when each of the buildings was proposed. It was never formally adopted because there was no provision or reason to have it. But there was an informal master plan that had been developed many, many years ago on it. Each of the Merit 7 buildings was approved by site plan review. So again, what we're talking about here is giving you a formality of a master plan approval, but then it's the same basic concept that was used with Merit 7, that as each building is built, it came in on site plan review. And I think we can all agree that they're pretty significant buildings. The other, just moving through the rest of this, and we've gotten through a lot of the heavy lifting at this point. In the parking, and it's parking structures that we're specifically talking about, the commission has, and for understandable reasons, required that there be an active use for at least 50% of the facade of a building, along the street frontage of a building. Completely understood, completely understandable as to why that would be the case. In our case, there's two wrinkles to that, and so we had proposed, and staff came up with some language that we found acceptable, but I wanted to point out why we had this particular language. If you look at building 2.1, which is the building right here, it's the one that is basically somewhat across from the train station. It's where the train parking is. The base of that building all along the front, with the exception of right here where there's a vehicular entrance, but all along the front of that building is retail. But on the second and third floors, there's parking that goes all the way across. So we meet the goal of the regulation, which is to create an active street front, an area that is lively and not a desert oasis of non-use along the front of this building. But up above on the second and third floors, there's parking. And we think that that's not inappropriate because it really doesn't impact the streetscape per se. Similarly, the parking garage at the back of building 1.1, because of the peculiarity of Glover coming along here and Oakwood coming up behind it, has an exposure of the garage to Oakwood. Now, there's like no possible active use that we can think of that would make sense at the dead end of a parking garage. And frankly, we almost meet the 50% criteria because of the curve of this building of 1.1 to which it's attached up Oakwood to begin with. But we felt that it was appropriate not to try and stretch the truth on this. So we felt that what we wanted to do was to make it clear that the commission would have the right, if they again approve it, to allow for the same building facade materials to be used in the design of the overall building, and the vehicles within the parking structure can't be visible from the street, from the exterior of the building. So again, that would mean that this building looks just like it would. This becomes a consistent use. You will certainly still have your bite at the apple because of the site plan standards to deal with things like lighting and landscaping and what have you, to address what the back of this piece looks like. But those are the two rationales for why this language with respect to the parking garages is being proposed.
Eva, is there anything that concerns you with that?
No, I think that's fair. I think that's something where I think that in one of the other, I think it was under the site plan aspect that you have the peer review part of that. And I think that's where I think we would take a hard look at that design to make sure it's attractive and make sure it looks like the building and not just like, because sometimes, when you screen parking, it still looks like screen parking.
Looks like
it's
parking.
not very attractive. Yeah. So I think that's where we'd probably have to hammer that home.
The next set of changes is actually a conforming change. The commission a while ago, back in 2019, changed the parking requirements for multifamily developments throughout Norwalk. There was a separate line item in that parking chart for commercial PRDs, which among others are the three buildings at the curb, the building at 399 Main Avenue, and the building at 1 Glover. And inadvertently, I believe, it just never got picked up that those are the only multifamily dwelling unit requirements in Norwalk that for parking that didn't get changed. So all this does is it says that commercial PRDs and development parks have the same multifamily parking requirements as every other multifamily development in Norwalk.
And that's the 1 point, that's just the across the line there, 1.3 per dwelling unit.
Exactly, except if you have a mixed use development. And of course, here you would have some that would have retail as well. And so then it's the greater of the 1.3 per residential unit, or the requirements for the commercial uses at 1 space and residential at 1 space per. So it's the language, the formula that you've already adopted. It's just now being applied to these as well. The next two changes, actually, ironically, are highly appropriate given the action that you took with Attorney Suchi just recently. The first one is to specify, normally when a special permit is granted, there's a requirement that the resolution of approval be recorded, and there's a requirement that the Mylar be recorded that shows what's been approved. What we've proposed here is that in addition to that, with the approval of a master plan, not only would we record the resolution and the map, but all of the associated master plan documents. So that would include the pictures that show the bulk of the buildings. It would include the tables that show the FAR and all the rest of that stuff. The idea being that it then becomes clear on the land records exactly what has been approved. So it expands what you would normally require for site plan or for a special permit recording to allow for a greater amount. The second amendment that you see there is the one that Attorney Suchi was asking you for, which is that normally a special permit, if a building permit is not obtained within a year, the special permit lapses. In this case, we know, first of all, that even if we get the special permit for the master plan, we couldn't go get a building permit anyway, because we would still need to have site plan review of the individual development of a building. And in addition to that, because of the fact that we're talking about somewhere between 7 and 8 buildings, it's not likely that that is all going to occur within a year anyway. In fact, it would make no sense.
David, you can do it.
I know that Carl would love to, but nonetheless.
Get cracking.
So what we've proposed here is that the special permit has to be filed, of course, but then the time for the building permit would be extended out to 10 years instead. And lastly, we get to the schedule of height and bulk of buildings. And this is where we had talked about some of the things that had been in the proposed regulations, which I think they're adopted here. And I think this is the appropriate place to put them. So the first one has to do with height. And what you'll see here are 3 columns. One of them, the third column in, is what is the existing text of the executive office zone requirements. The one immediately to the right of that is what is permitted or required for commercial PRDs. And commercial PRDs are only permitted in the executive office zone. So again, it's apples to apples. And then what you see on the far right is the proposed changes. So the first change is on height, where currently the height you're allowed is 8 stories and 100 feet. Hotels are allowed to 12 stories and 150 feet, or multifamily commercial PRDs, 11 stories and 125 feet. And what we have proposed and is shown on our plans is that it's 15 stories and 150 feet that are allowed in a development park. Now, it doesn't mean that every building is going to be that high, but it does mean that that would be the highest it could be. The 150 feet was picked specifically because it's what's currently allowed. If we built a hotel, we could go to 150 feet. So we didn't go beyond that. The fact that you might get 15 stories within that 150 feet as opposed to 12 stories within that 150 feet is partly because with a hotel, you would have generally higher ceilings on the first couple of floors for some of the public areas, ballrooms or lobbies or what have you. And that's part of the reason that it's 150, but still only 12 feet. But again, from our perspective, we have not gone above the height limitation that's already permitted in that zone. The next one is the building area. And again, this one, we did agree that stating it twice wasn't a bad thing. And that is again, the statement that a minimum of 20% of the overall site must be publicly available open space. So we felt that was it was okay to repeat that one twice here because it does make sense to state it here. The FAR, we have proposed not 2.0, but 2.2. Part of the reason for that is because with the amenities that we are putting in and some of the additional things that are now required as we've refined the site plan, we feel that it's appropriate to be able to have a bit more flexibility on that. The reason that we came to 2.2 was because in your other downtown zones, which allow for amenity incentives when there are public amenities that are provided, it's a 10% incentive that is the maximum that can be granted. So in this particular case, instead of going to 2.0, we wanted to go to 2.2, which would be the 10% increase. Again, we could have done it on the basis of adding the same language that you would find in the central business district. That if the commission finds that there's, X types of public amenities, then they can grant additional FAR or whatever it was. But frankly, for the reasons that we talked about earlier, that this is really, again, it's a development park within an executive office zone. So that's the only way that it applies. Do we really need to say all that? Or could we just say that let's cut to the chase because again, you're either going to approve it or not approve it? And the last two are stated here, they're in red, but they are what is the recreation area that's required in a development park and what's the residential density that's required in a development park. The point here is that the executive office zone column, which is that one in the middle, didn't have anything for residential requirements in it. Instead, we created the column for commercial PRDs, which are only allowed in an executive office zone. And so that's where the standard was. What we're now saying is that we really should be saying that in the executive office zone as a whole. And so it's exactly the same. We're not asking for anything more than the density and the recreation area requirements that were provided for the curb and for 399 Main Avenue and for 1 Glover. It's just being stated here as a general statement for executive office zone, not just for commercial PRDs. And that brings us through the text amendment.
David, since we've seen you last, there's an awful lot of talk about federal infrastructure funding. And I was wondering if you've heard of any movement on the state's part in terms of the infrastructure improvements that are necessary to make it possible to move this forward.
Mr. Schulman, I know that there have been extensive discussions on this. I haven't been involved in all of them, but people from our company, together with people in Hartford and Wethersfield, have definitely been in discussions. And I know that because of the availability of funds, the potential availability of funds, that this is very high on people's radar. It is not something, one of the people here in the office was saying that it's sort of like the train is starting to leave the station. You want to make sure you're on it when it leaves. So we definitely are highly sensitized to the fact that this is a potential opportunity that we want to make sure we can take advantage of.
Great job. Do you have any issues with the 10-year approval?
No, I think it only makes sense in this instance, just because if you recall that we've kind of had preliminary discussions about phasing the project into 3 phases, where you have a southern phase, which is kind of consistent with, and speaking from more like from a traffic impact perspective, that the lower phase would be something that was consistent with what was already occurring on the overall area now, whereas the middle phase improvements would be tied to improvements at the 7 Merritt interchange. And then the third or northern phase probably would be tied to the Main Ave, Glover, Gristmill improvements that are kind of a little further back on the drawing board, but hopefully to the chairman's point is something that can get maybe fast tracked or expedited if there's infrastructure funds available.
Gotcha. And then David, hypothetically speaking, if the max story went from, let's say, 15 to 20, how many more workforce housing would be in something like that?
Well, it's a percentage of the total number. So again, it's what, 10%, I believe it is. So
Yeah, was it 10% more? Okay.
Yeah, based on that's potential. I mean, if it's a potentially 100 units or so, plus or minus.
For 5 additional floors?
No. I thought you were
Oh.
talking about the overall project. Sorry.
No, I was saying if you increase the height, is that something worth considering? It's such a unique area.
Yeah, I do think there will be some pushback about the height and just in general. I mean, that always is a concern. So I think beyond what's already permitted would be another hurdle to overcome.
yeah, we felt that too, that better to keep to what's already permitted, because that's easily justifiable, as opposed to asking for something more that people could say, why should you go in that direction?
I hear that.
Anything further from the commission members for Attorney Waters?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and commission members, as always. We're still working our way through. There's a few more things that we still need to work with your staff on. One of them is that design manual, which will clearly flesh out some of the specifics as far as things like street treatments and things like that. My hope would be that we would be able to get that done within the next 30 days or so, and that we would then be able to try and put all of this together. In the meantime, I'll work with your staff on finalizing the text that we've just been talking about and cleaning it up so that it actually is presentable as an application, and in formatting and what have you. And we look forward to further conversations and to traffic funding.
Thank you. Let's move on in the agenda. Next item is 2021-20 RM, Building Zone Regulation Text Amendment to create the East Norwalk Village TOD, the EVTZ, and to allow dwelling units and artist live workspaces within the industrial number 1 zone. I remind the commission members again of something that came up in the public hearing that we held on this. And that is that this really just represents implementation of what's already been approved in the POCD. And I know we're going to have another public hearing on this. But I do think that we need to keep that in mind as we move this forward. That all we're doing is implementing the recommendations that have already been approved. Okay. With that, Steve, I believe you're making that presentation.
Sure, and I sent everybody out. Can you guys see my screen? Just want to make sure it's visible.
Yes.
So, we had the joint hearing last month to get feedback on different aspects of it. We heard a lot, and a lot of the same things we heard previously from and there was, to the chairman's point, some of it was kind of reliving the planning study a little bit, where we've already, I think that the discussion about traffic and discussion about some of those things, while I understand the point, and they're not invalid points, but I think some of those bridges have already been crossed. And so the intent of that was to look at the zoning that's proposed and whether that zoning is correct or not correct. And for the most part, I think what's in front of you now and what you've seen several different times is consistent with what was approved as part of the plan. I know there's still some discussion, and staff still has some questions, on our end on the amenity system and the various points and those kind of things. I have solicited some input from, I had Bob Griswatz look at it. So he provided some comments, and I did make some edits, which are in the draft that you see online. That was the links that were shared with you as well. With some of those changes, we still have a couple small things that we're working on in terms of the, like the solar question, for the point system. Should it be based on the percent of the roof cover, the amount of power generated? So we're still working on a couple of those things. So my thought was we should probably spend some time, similar to what Attorney Waters just did, going through those, the section by section and any of the changes, and answer any questions you may have. And then maybe at your next meeting, which I think is November 4th, having one final discussion, and then maybe holding the final hearing on this on December 12th, and going forward at that point, if that's something that makes sense for everybody. Okay. So, and I'll just hit the, and if you have questions about any aspect, please stop me along the way, but I'll stop where and some of this is also wordsmithing, and Bob had picked up on this. So like if there's red text, as in number 2 there, that was just something he flagged. So I added that in. And this one was a carryover before, and this came up a couple different times where there were concerns about, is this amount of retail space or service space too large to permit via site plan approval? So I wanted to just bring that up and get any comment and see if we're comfortable with that, or we wanted to adjust that at all.
So what's like a comparable 25,000 square feet? Like what's a comparable building in Norwalk that's roughly that size?
I'm trying to think. I don't know if I have an address, but like a decent sized CVS, for example, would be about 25,000.
Okay.
So perhaps the Rite Aid on East Avenue?
Yeah, I can confirm that actually pretty easily. At some point, I can check that tomorrow if that's something you wanted to verify. But I bet you that's probably in the ballpark. It might be this might be a little bigger, but I'm not positive. I can look that up.
That'd be super helpful just as a comparison point. The number just doesn't mean much.
Yeah, I wish I would have thought of that ahead of time, but yeah, if there's a break while you guys are discussing something, I'll go back and see if I can dig that out quick.
Because that has changed from like 8. I remember it being like much lower earlier on, and we moved it up, and it's sort of, I think, landing somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and kind of part of the kind of thought process for raising it up, at least on my end, is that, if we're moving in the direction, which in part of the overall code into kind of a quasi form-based code in many aspects, is that we've kind of not so much worrying about the individual tenancy of some of these spaces and more so on the form of things. So that's kind of where that comes from. But if you think that maybe the size from a traffic generation point might warrant lowering it, then I really wouldn't put up much of an argument. All right, apologize for my scrolling. Okay, and if anybody has questions on any of the uses or anything, please let me know. I think we tried to be as inclusive and consistent as possible throughout that whole process. And just to highlight this, no changes proposed here, but just to draw everybody's attention to this, this was kind of the the diagram where the parcels that abut this, where the yellow outline is, they're required to provide some kind of ground floor activation, which is defined in here. We did not wrap that around all of Gregory Boulevard. There's no secret there's an interest to develop this parcel down here at some point. So that's something to keep in mind. Our thought was, is it really necessary to wrap more commercial down through here? But, if you felt that was something you'd like to see, we can easily amend the map to.
Is that the bank site, Steve?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
And this area is a little bit open-ended, and I should have a little better answer on this tomorrow. Since this was kind of drafted, the DPW has come up with streetscape standards for this area. The TMP department's been restaffed over the last year, and they would like to see a wider sidewalk through this area be required. So they wanted to bump that out to 9 feet to get a better area for tree planting as well as wider sidewalks. So assuming that's the direction it goes, that probably gets tweaked a little bit. And that also kind of plays into the point system too, because you're taking a little bit more of the developable site away from them for other purposes. So that might play into the some things like the courtyard space or the public seating space. So we'll tweak that formula a little bit more after I have that conversation, and I'll keep you apprised of any changes there.
Steve, on point 11 here, do we need who has oversight over the fee in lieu payments?
For the particular to the rec space?
Yeah.
No one is, that fee has been there. No one's ever actually
Ever used it?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly. That's a good question. It's a good question. I don't think I have a good answer for you, but
No worries. I didn't know if it's been there and no one's really used it, something just to think about in the future. I didn't know if that was new %.
Yeah, I think that's something. If we do start collecting significant funds for that, we'd probably put a system in place to handle that. I mean, my guess is that we won't see much of that, and it'll be a small amount, so it won't be something we have to deal with right away. Okay. On number 3, we just removed the waterfront esplanade just because there's really nothing touching the waterfront here. The Bank of America site does have the pond in the back, but I don't think that's the kind of same thing we're talking about in terms of the esplanade. So I'll slow way down here because I know the commission's expressed interest in, going through the point system in more detail. And I know one thing Bob had raised a question about. He's like, just based on the lot sizes and how they were laid out, that he thought, you're going to end up with a lot of outdoor seating area and plaza area. So where you have commercial space, that can be a good thing where they're adjacent to that and provide seating for, if it's a restaurant or a cafe or something. But I don't necessarily know you want to see the whole area develop as one large outdoor seating area. I think there would, you'd end up having a lot of space that was not necessarily utilized all the time. So that's something to think about in terms of how we structure the final part of the point system for this.
Do you have any suggestions towards that?
The question is the 1 per 500 the right ratio? Something to point out within this is this area, this requirement through here. If you can read that text, it does say, in addition to the square footage you're providing, you're also providing other items within that, some of the seating areas, the shaded seating, and all those kind of factors that play in. So it's obviously not the intent of this to have just a broad rectangular space with no activity or nothing going on. Hopefully it's laid out in a very attractive manner, and it's got features in it that draw you to it, in addition to whatever the commercial draw might be on that particular location.
And you don't double count, correct? So if you going this bonus up here, the 3 features below are not also counted?
I think in this instance, you would have, so you had, say, a 1,000 square foot plaza, plus if you put in, some of these funds, you would get a point or so for those in addition to.
Gotcha. So you get in addition. So let's take that. So the 1,000-foot plaza gives you 2 points plus the 3 features. So you're like halfway there.
Well, I don't know if you'd be halfway there, because I think you got to get up to, if you're talking about 25 points, you're maybe like a third of the way there.
25. What's 25 points? It's 15 and 20, right?
Yeah, let me go. Is it 15 and 20? You might be more right than me. Let me just go down.
If we want to bump it up.
Oh, you're correct. Sorry about that. Yeah, 15 and 20.
Okay. But we are not considering the plaza as being the green, the 2/3 required, correct?
No, so that, no, it would not, because those all fall under this category here.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so all these are under the
The
infrastructure umbrella. And this, to your point, though, this number might need to change, especially if we get to the point where we have to widen the sidewalks a little bit to make a better streetscape. We might want to knock that down a little bit, but I'll know a little bit more after tomorrow.
Cool.
All the pictures show people sitting, like reading, talking. It's a beautiful day. At least 7 months of the year in Connecticut, you can't use a plaza like that. Which is, is there any way to adapt those plazas for more winter use?
That's a good point and a good question. I think there's ways they could try to activate those spaces in the winter if they really wanted to have, I think if you were at Ironworks, for example, they could turn that space into, they could put fire pits out there, and assuming the fire marshal said so, they could do some things like that to have different winter activities. You could have, if you had a large enough space, and you could have you could build a skate pond or something like that. I don't know if
exactly
these smaller spaces you could do something like that, unless somebody had a outdoor dining with heaters that were out there or something like that.
Yeah, a little skate pond in one of them would be wonderful. Then it goes away in the spring, but there isn't much of that.
I need an operator for that too.
Yeah, that's true.
And they're actually really hard to find these days, unless there's already one that is used in and around.
Yeah, it's a fair point that some of those plazas, from, Christmas time, you might, if there was enough shops there, for example, whether that comes to pass, I don't know, but if there was foot traffic through there, January, February, March, there's a high likelihood that there would be a lot of idle activity in those areas. Very possible.
Well, January, February, March. Yeah, for sure. But even if there aren't a lot of retail shops, December is a pretty bleak, cold time of year too.
Yeah, and that goes just back to the initial point of the discussion, whether you want to, if you think that formula is too high, or the is weighted too heavily in that direction, that's something we can adjust as well. Keeping in mind, though, to Mr. Cantor's point, 2/3 of the points, regardless of which avenue you choose, have to fall under this category here. So they have to provide points in whether it's going through some kind of equivalency of LEED or something similar. The rain gardens, rain gardens including art, whether we talked about the pollinator habitats, the solar, the green roofs, the blue roofs. It would be great if somebody looked at geothermal or some kind of porous pavement in those areas as well. But that just keep that in mind, that 2/3 of those points do need to come from that grouping.
Steve, on that,
It's come from the environmentally, the green roofs, the you know, the blue roofs, the solar, et cetera, right? Was that what you were saying?
Right, so 2/3, so if you went for the 20 points, you'd have to get, you know, what's 2/3 of that? 14, 15 points, something like that.
Steve, given the size of the properties, is it realistic to expect to be able to build out some of these amenities?
On the, you know, what we looked at was, you know, when you get to, based on what we think, if you get to about a half-acre size, it gets more viable. So if you think about East Avenue, and I can pull up a map if it's helpful, but a lot of those parcels are small. So if things are going to develop, they're going to redevelop in tandem through, you know, accumulation of parcels.
Right.
The individual, you know, if somebody's on a 1/4 acre lot, it's narrow, it's going to be difficult to do things there, which is probably why, one of the reasons why there hasn't been much change in that area for a long time.
Do we need to bet anything about upkeep or maintenance of some of the sustainable outdoor elements, whether the gardens, the green walls? I just worry someone puts something up and it craps out in 6 months and, you know, they don't really do anything about it. And maybe it's just part of the approval of those enforcement already baked in.
I mean, technically, if those specific amenities were approved as part of the special permit process, they would have to maintain those. I think the best, I mean, we could always work that language in here, but I would say the best, more appropriate place would be as a condition of approval that whatever amenities are specifically proposed and approved must be maintained through the life of the development.
And Steve, what tools, if any, do we have should someone not maintain an amenity? Let's say someone puts in a green wall, it turns brown, and they refuse to do anything about it.
Well, I mean, the quick and first avenue would be to start an enforcement action, and they would, you know, go through the citation process where they could be fined for daily for non-compliance.
Okay.
So that's where I think you want to have very specific language in your approval indicating that, you know, what needs to be done if and when there's a failure, or, you know, trees die, landscaping dies, they have to be replaced in a, you know, timely manner.
Like what you said earlier, I think is really interesting on how to do the calculations for the solar and geothermal. And also I like that you cap those at a particular, you know, a max of 5 points, such that other things hopefully are going to be used or that are more at the community, at the ground level, whether it's these gardens or other things. And it seemed like that was a bit of the intent there of like, it's not all going to be building focused potentially.
Yeah, and the tricky thing with the solar and geothermal, very similar, why we kind of have it still highlighted in yellow, because we're haven't settled on a recommendation yet, is just because, and Brian had raised this question with me, he's like, well, what happens so if you did 50% of the roof is solar, but the technology of the solar panels improves so much that you don't need that 50%, or, you know, and I had a conversation with somebody about this, like, you know, sometimes in, you know, condominium type buildings or mixed use buildings, the landlord pays for the electricity uses for the common space or the exterior, whereas the individual tenants may pay electricity on their individual units. So you have to make sure the wording is such that they weren't able to just do the electricity for the parking lot lights, and the entire building wasn't encumbered by that same restriction. So that's why I'm just still a little bit of unsure of the best method, but I think we're getting closer, and we should have a final recommendation in the next couple of weeks. And I think,
are there any of these that you'd want to max out so people couldn't just do, I don't know, maybe the pollinator pathway or whatever, the pollinator habitat, like, do you wanna, would you max any of those so you can't do all 10 in that? I don't know what people think about that.
Yeah, so I think if you read the column on the right, the third column, it's total maximum points available per amenity. So, you know, the green balls max at 2, rain gardens.
Oh, I'm sorry. I read it as if you did, I read it as if you did 500, if you did 1,000, you would get 4, for example.
No, and if that's
Gotcha.
not clear, yeah, you know what? Your point is fair though, because the language isn't consistent.
In some
So
places
let
you write max of, in some
Yeah.
places.
I'll,
Okay.
I'll go back and clarify that, but that's the idea is that, and that was raised at the public hearing where somebody could mention the, I was like, well, it's only 2 points, so I don't
Yeah.
see, but I'll make sure the language is consistent.
Steve, what if I put in a rain garden that's also a pollinator? Can I get additional points for that?
I think they would need, based on the examples that I've seen, they'd need to be 2 distinct things. I mean, I've
Mhm.
never, and I cannot say I'm sure somebody's come up with some hybrid rain garden / pollinator habitat, but I think
Right.
that's when, I think you'd have some leeway there to say, wait a minute, we're not buying this.
Right. And not entirely to Nick's point, but it does touch on it. What if a site has multiple rain gardens, say one at each end of the property? Would that qualify as twice the points?
No, because if this is, so if we take this language here and make sure it's maximum of 2 points per rain,
Mhm.
then that's a decision you'd have to make. If they did put in 2 500 square foot rain gardens, would you
Right.
want to give them more points, or would you
Yeah,
want to
that's
cap
that's
it
the
out?
blue. That was exactly, you nailed the head on the question I was trying to say, like, could you max out with those one particular items?
So I think
We
you
should
could-
decide and the language should reflect what we decide.
Yeah, so you could, I mean, you could always change this up here where the amenity is per site, or if you wanted to clarify it in the text next to it, then however you prefer we do that, and I'm happy to take that on.
Well, up at the top there, the eligibility for the lead. Does the use of solar panels, for example, qualify for lead status, or could it qualify for lead status?
It's included in the point system. It's part of the overall point system. The text in red I put in based on what Bob had said. He had a concern. He said one thing with lead is because you do get points for items that are not necessarily what we're trying to drive at in terms of sustainability with this
Right.
aspect. So he's looking at that's why he said, you know, should be tied to the construction and site development, and not just because we're a quarter mile from a train station. So we already understand that. So you shouldn't necessarily be getting points for that.
And could we get into a language contest with someone who puts in a bike rack and argues it's worth 6 points, and we say no, that's only a 1 point item or a 2 point item?
Technically, I'm sure we probably could. I mean, if you want me to dig into some of that a little deeper in terms of the point system and how if it's broken out by category a little more, and see if we can be more specific on exclusions.
Well, I'd like to avoid getting into, if you will, a kind of pissing contest with someone who is putting in these amenities. I'd like both them and us to know more clearly what they can expect going into it.
Yeah, and I think also keep in mind that what you max that out at is also relevant too.
Right.
Only other question I had on this piece is down in the miscellaneous amenity section. on the rent reduction. And am I reading that right, that the reduction is only needs to last for 5 years, and then after that, it's can go back up to market rate?
Correct.
I don't know what people's view of that, but that feels a little, you get it, with all these other amenities, it's in perpetuity. This one feels like you fight the time for 5 years, you build the higher building, you wait out your time, and then you're back at market rate, and you provide nothing towards the community. And, I don't know what people's view on this one. It felt like there was a loophole here that seemed
Well,
worth potentially addressing.
this could probably hurt people because, like you said, I guess in 5 years they would end up having to find a new location.
I'm guessing this is more intended for residency reduction of something. I don't know exactly.
I
Maybe not.
assumed it was for commercial.
Oh, great.
It's commercial. Yeah.
Oh, it's commercial. Oh,
Gotcha.
okay.
Yeah, and if we can I can put commercial rent reduction if you wanted to.
Yeah, and there are any number of programs available to commercial businesses to lower their rent or lower their taxes for a specified period of time, after which it goes away.
Yeah, this is not for the residential. That would kind of
Okay.
contradict our workforce housing rate.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
enterprise zones work that way, a reduction in taxes for a certain period of time and it goes away. So this is not.
Yeah.
this
Actually, it's sort of spelled out in there anyway, because it says on the ground floor area and you can't
Ground
do the
floor.
residential on the ground floor. So, but I'll put commercial there so it's more clear.
Okay. Thank you.
Is there anything else?
Steve, just a general question. And I guess I have the same question about North 7. Both this and the approval of the North 7 development plan, are we going to be acting on those, or is it more likely that the new commission will be acting on those?
I think for the North 7, I think it's definitely going to be the new commission based on timing. With this, what I was thinking, I would just hopefully have final answers on some of these highlighted items here with a final recommendation come back at your next meeting, which I think is on November 4th.
Mhm.
Then assuming you're okay with that, and plus any final tweaks we do at that point, then start the formal referral process and then have the public hearing on December 12th.
Okay.
I think you could move it at that point.
I'm wondering if it doesn't make sense, especially with the 7 project, from this point on, to invite members of the zoning commission to observe the meetings of the planning commission, and to invite members of the planning commission to observe the meetings of the zoning commission. Just as city residents, they wouldn't have any other opportunity, but maybe just sharing the calendar with both groups, so that if people want to kind of get a peek in to what the other part of the revised commission is going to look like, they can get some advance on that.
Yeah, we can send the links out for the meetings. That's easy enough. Did you want to go through? There were a few tweaks to the design guidelines, not a lot. If you wanted to go through those as well.
Sure.
Happy to walk through. Okay, and similar, only items in red, and there weren't a lot
Right.
with this document that Bob had gone through. let me know if you want to go through any of these. And a lot of this is more just text cleanup than anything else. Yeah, and there's one area I will go through in a little bit of detail at the end of this because it is pretty new and I rewrote some of it myself. So, and again, I highlight that even though it's a little repetitive from the zoning, it's the sidewalks again, and as I said, I'll have a little more information on that tomorrow.
Isn't 9 feet for a sidewalk really pretty large?
That includes a planting strip too. So they want to have a planting strip for trees and light posts and all as well. So it's the public space would be 9, but the sidewalk hard surface would probably be like 5.
Hmm.
But that would be a clear 5.
Correct.
With no-
Yeah, for ADA purposes as well.
Right.
And there's really no changes to most of this. The one big change area was regarding the signage, because the more I looked at the signage, oh, and that might be in the other text now that I squint back. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I skipped that whole thing. Oh, yeah, sorry, we never got to the bottom of this document, but I'll go back to the other one as well if you like. But this was an item that we put in kind of as a little bit of give the commission a little bit of flexibility if there was something that we haven't identified yet as an amenity that we thought was appropriate and was consistent with the other items that we proposed, that's something that the commission could consider. I know that a couple of times the public has raised some concerns about what that would actually be, and does that give too much discretion, and would it not be consistent with the plan, et cetera. So let me know if you're comfortable with that language or not comfortable with that language.
I think it's important to let people be creative.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the one tricky thing was, I just want to get feedback on this before we get into the signs, was, right, this is fairly consistent now with where the language requires that buildings in the area be 10 feet back from the zone. That would also be parking. Now, would you want to give any little bit of deference to parking if there was adequate screening in between, so that would not hinder the building envelope too much? So I just wanted to run that by you guys before we finalized anything.
I would be flexible on that. I don't know what other people.
And I'll double check some of the other zones just to see what the language is in there. Maybe we can make it consistent with that. I think the key thing is having the proper screening, and that's the big thing, so it's not visible, more so than anything else. But I'll take another peek at that too. So the one area that I did kind of start from, not scratch, but I kind of reorganized it and reworded it, because Norwalk's sign regulations, that good thing we're rewriting them because they're kind of a disaster. And they're just completely inconsistent from zone to zone, and they're just too permissive on the kinds of signs and signage that's allowed. So, the one thing that we did hear a lot in the planning process was the kind of a maritime feel of the area. So I kind of looked at the signage in a way that was more villagey feel to it than having lots of light boxes, lots of neon necessarily, and lots of kind of unattractive large signs. So we pulled some of the language from the existing regulations in terms of the kind of signs like a real estate signs or like a temporary opening sign, a construction sign, those kind of things. We've kind of carried that forward, but then looked at, what should the signage be for the area as a whole. So I didn't really mess around with the square footages that were already laid out in the regulations. But what I did was look at ways to control the aesthetic of the sign. We have no control over content of sign. That's the Supreme Court has already told us you can't do that. But what we've tried to do here is control the type of lighting that's provided. So it's not, necessarily backlit signs. It's not neon. It's not something that's just kind of gaudy. It's more of a attractive, sometimes like a gooseneck lighting that lights down on a sign that could be on the wall and or could be on a hanging sign. I think it's a more attractive look and I think would fit better into this area than some other kinds of, signs that we're seeing right now. And we do get complaints about some of the signs that go up, even signs that conform, we get complaints about. So I think this is a way to kind of mitigate that and add some uniformity to the area.
So those awful like feather signs in front of buildings would not be permitted or allowed?
No, they're probably not permitted now anyway.
Yeah.
Unless somebody was doing a grand opening, we might give them a little break while they're opening their business for them. But for the most part, they're not supposed to be putting those up. And again, if you have questions on these, even after we talk about this tonight, we can revisit it on November 4th before it gets finalized.
Did Bob read through these?
No, I kind of redid these myself.
Is it worth having him just take a read?
Yeah, I can ask him what he thinks.
Steve, don't you think, can you go back up again, back to the other way? Right there. Shouldn't we have consistency in directional signs throughout the district?
Well, yeah, I would agree that where do you think it's not consistent?
Louis, you're saying like the same sign in every shop or parking area for directional? Like literally saying like, here's the 4x4 that you get.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do we have authority to do that, Steve?
Well, you can't regulate the content of the sign. You could say, I think you could say that if it was a enter here, for example, or exit here, you could probably do something like that. I got to think about that one a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's more user friendly. People know what kind of sign they're looking for.
Okay. I'll look into that. Anything else?
No, I think you've done a nice job on this.
I agree. I think this is a huge step forward. This is something super minor, but I've noticed that the parking signs in Norwalk, in terms of the color, it's not standard with other cities I've seen, and it's like a light color. It's sometimes hard for the eye to see, and I've heard that from a few of our residents at the Waypoint. A comment that's neither here nor there, but just wanted to offer it.
Okay. Yeah, and I thought Waypoint had done like a revised sign package. I don't know if they ever, when that new group that purchased the properties, they were going to rebrand and re-sign everything. I don't know if they ever followed through on that.
No, they haven't. We haven't had that happen yet.
Okay, well, that's good. I can reach out to them, see what's going on too. Okay.
All right. Next item on the agenda is the industrial zone study presentation. Steve,
All right,
you up for it?
sure. If I can find it on my screen, I'll share my screen. All right, so I'm assuming everybody can see it, so I'll just start diving ahead. As you know, we've been reporting back pretty regularly to the commission. You do have Mr. Ruina and Mr. Schulman who've been taking active part in the oversight of the plan, which has been, going on for a little while now. The draft report came out last month. So right now we're just kind of showing it to public bodies. I presented to Planning Committee of Common Council a couple of weeks ago, Planning Commission, I believe last week, and now with you guys. Today, I did send it out to all the contractors that we have contact with, because I just wanted to let them know, what's being proposed, since, they're one user group that's going to be directly affected by this. I don't want this to be any kind of surprise for them. So kind of some key takeaways from the plan. And these are some, and I'll be honest, I don't know if there's any sometimes with a plan, I like to come up with a really kind of aha moment. And this one, I don't know if we really had one of those aha moments. It was a little drier in that regard, but I think it was needed to be a little drier just based on some of the issues that came up during the process. One thing that, I noticed immediately when I got here is that our zoning regulations don't define a lot of things that we talk about a lot. So what we want to do is really have solid and clear definitions on these different types of industrial uses, and also on the types of contractor yards, because we kind of lumped all contractors together. So if you're one of those large earth moving yards and you're moving dirt around constantly all day, and the neighbors don't necessarily like you, you're getting lumped in. Or if you're, for example, a plumber who's got 4 trucks, but you store some conduit on site, you're kind of lumped together. And I don't think it's necessarily fair that they're treated the same. So I think that's one thing we've come up with, is ways to define those and differentiate those. Also, where should the industrial boundaries be? I think it's pretty clear if you've ever driven on any of the smaller side streets in the South Norwalk area, that you go from one property to the next and the use has changed at a blink of an eye, where you have a contractor yard that's been there for 40, 50 years, right next to a 3-family house. The next one's a house, the next one's a contractor yard. So where should these areas get repurposed to and redefined as? I think that's one of the things that the plan does, is lay out a rezoning strategy for those areas. And it also, as part of that, says, and this is very important to keep in mind. This question came up at the Planning Commission level, and it's to make it absolutely crystal clear that the city is in no way, shape, or form recommending we're going to take anybody's property. Anybody that's using their property legally right now, even if we rezone it, continue to use it in that same fashion, they just wouldn't be able to expand it beyond what they're using it for today. But, at the same time, it's not just the stick approach. There's also the carrot approach, where we want to incentivize better uses on these properties. So some things that we're seeing is the need for flex industrial and sometimes even warehouse space. And those have requirements for taller ground floors. So sometimes they need over 20 feet of ground floor space and high bay doors to get in and out. And there's constraints within our existing regulations on allowing that with our existing heights. So the study recommends bumping up those heights, with measures in place to protect residential areas if you're in proximity to those. And allowing uses on the upper floors that can help subsidize that ground floor commercial space, because we know sometimes that's not always the most economically viable use of that land. But if we require that on the ground floor and allow some other uses on the upper floors that help pay for that ground floor, that might be the way to go. And then something else we'll look at more closely and probably look at best practices in other communities is how do you better deal with contractor yards in terms of, and industrial users for that matter, in terms of the screening that it's required versus what we do now. So we'll come up with a set of standards we feel is more appropriate for these uses.
I have one question, Steve.
Yep.
If you, for the people with a single family or 3-family house and a single family house, excuse me, between 2 contractor yards, if it's all rezoned to be industrial, so that they can, of course, live there in the family, the houses as long as they want to, that nobody's taking their land. But does that increase or decrease the value of that property?
Based on, so that they're kind of right now within that zone, in most of those zones, you can't do multifamily residential anyway. So you could be limited to that. You're kind of limited to what you have now anyway. The value of industrial land is a lot higher than the residential land in these areas. So I actually think you'd be increasing the value of it.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I wasn't certain of that. So frequently when we do this rezoning, people can keep doing what they're doing, whatever it is they're doing. But the value of the property goes up. It really benefits them.
I think so too. And that very question came up when and this was a little before my time, but then they were, and I think it's off Lebrano Place, where they were storing the roll-offs on that piece of property when they didn't have permission to. And I forgot the name of it. It's the land that's behind 57 Chestnut up on the hill, where there's some approved contractor yards there. I don't think there's any activity at the moment.
Not Cassuth or Cassuth Street or Olean Street.
Yeah, in that area, Michael. Yeah,
Okay.
I can't remember the exact address, but there was conversations on how do you repurpose those for other uses, and we were looking at some housing options at one point. But the property was valued so much higher because it was industrial zoned that there was no reason for them to do anything different with the property.
Just a lot of contractor yards in that area. I do remember that.
Yeah. And like that was the area I was kind of thinking about when I was saying, you go from property to property and the use changes one to the next. There's zero consistency in any of those areas.
Yeah.
But this
it
could provide for consistency, like over a 10, 15, 20-year period of time.
Exactly. Yeah.
You're become consistent, right?
You're beating me to the punch, Galen. Yes, that is definitely the idea with this. Yeah, and these changes definitely will not happen overnight. The idea is over time you'll get the uniformity in the areas and develop more cohesive neighborhoods. And also, if you allow the contractors to operate next to each other, you get that there's less conflict with neighbors because there's that's a contractor next door and a contractor on the other side, so you're not dealing with those specific issues. So the plan kind of classifies industrial uses into 4 categories, and they don't necessarily translate into zoning districts, but they translate more in terms of the types of uses and activities that can occur there. So, right now we have a heavy industrial zone, which is our industrial 1 zone, and there's really not any change proposed within that. But it does shrink quite a bit, and we'll go through that in a little bit. The next zone, which will line up towards what we classify as the I2 zone, allows a lot of the same manufacturing type uses, also allows contractors, but doesn't allow some of the more noxious uses like the waste management uses, the earth processing yards, the big, noisy, heavy industrial things. And how we've lined this up is when it kind of provides for a better transition from the heavy industrial to the residential. So the idea is over time that there's a buffer of noxious uses are separated from the residential areas. And hopefully that these areas that get rezoned to the lighter industrial, that you'll have uses in there that are more in keeping with the neighborhood, hopefully are job generating, and are just less visible and less intrusive to the neighborhood.
Say,
And then-
I have one more thing.
Sure.
You know, where there's like there's a 3-family house, let's say, in an industrial zone, or there's even just a single family house, but it's a rental, so it's providing affordable housing. So if that's sold because it becomes more valuable because it's industrial, is there any kind of provision we could have for some funds to go into an affordable housing? For affordable housing fund to build more affordable housing, because this is one of the gentrifications. It's not like building fancier things, but building industrial things instead that displace affordable housing.
Yeah, that's a good question. And one of the things that I'm working on now is, and this came out of my meeting with the planning committee, they were asking about how many businesses would become non-conforming, because there's more land that's going from heavy industrial to the lighter industrial or residential in many cases over time. So they asked me about that. So I'm kind of working on the mapping of that area now and calculating all the difference in the area. One thing to point out, and I'll get into it more detail a little later, though, with the industrial 2 area, it does introduce residential at a lower density. So if they did provide residential units in there, they do have to provide the same affordability requirements that are required elsewhere. So you will get some workforce units introduced to these areas. The tricky part of the gentrification thing is specific to the point that you raised is, since it is private property, if they were going to redevelop it to something else, even if we didn't change the zone, there's no requirement that we could place on them to keep it affordable outside of what we have for the workforce housing right now.
Mm-hmm.
In the last classification, I'm sorry, go ahead, Galen.
No, I said pressures of the market are what keeps it affordable.
Yeah.
And once the pressures of the market have changed.
Yeah, it's a good point. Definitely a good point. The last classification is kind of the mixed use artisan thing. And you can think about that as like a baker that was in a mixed use development, or a brewery or something like that. Somebody's making cookies or something like that. That's something that we'd like to see enhanced throughout the downtown wherever it's possible. One of the challenges that the consultants identified was also the height limitations, because the ground floor space for that also requires a little more height. So they recommended bumping up the height a little bit in some of those zones. So the 2 maps that you see here, the map on the left is the existing zoning, whereas the map on the right really just gets into some of the classifications. And we're going to get into these specifics of this in more detail in a little bit, but just to flag a few things for you on here. The kind of the black outline through here where you see all these white parcels, that's the area for the industrial waterfront study that we're looking at more closely. They also identified Norden, and this is kind of Lakota Oaks property up here. Nobody, whether it's UTL or TPUDC, has any idea what to do with the Lakota Oaks properties in terms of rezoning. So we've kind of just left that alone for right now. Whereas, this study says, Norden's such a unique piece of property that you really need to look at it more closely. So that's something that, maybe will happen at a future point. I mentioned to you earlier what the consultants are recommending for additional height, and then they flagged this would be more towards the artisan issue that they raise. You need that taller ground floor to allow those businesses to have the space they need on the ground floor. And then where you have the upper floors that could subsidize that ground floor use, and whether that's a mix of office, residential, office to support the ground floor tenant that's specific to them is another way that's looked as an incentive, as a way as part of the rezoning, where it's the kind of the carrot part of the carrot and stick. And this table on the right just looks at different things and different uses, whether it's manufacturing, different categories of industrial, such as the contractor yards, waste management, and then looks at some of the things to think about in terms of the rezoning going forward. I mentioned earlier that, while the overall recommendation for some of these industrial zones is to allow some increased height, we're very cognizant of impacts on residential properties if they abut those. So it's looking at some different tools, and one of these is a diagram that you see on the right, which is a height plane diagram, which talks about different step backs based on the height of the building and number of stories that are proposed. We do this right now, if you recall, in some of the residential zones where we require that no later than the 4th floor that you start to step the building back. This takes it a little further, which provides a sense of, a diagram where what's actually visible if you're on the street level across the street looking across at a new building. So we would look to implement some of these tools in the eventual rezoning of these areas. And some examples of some mixed-use building typologies that were identified, and just for examples, so people get a sense of what we're talking about. And you'll see this in different areas of the country, in some local examples is in Brooklyn. Obviously, we're not Brooklyn or Boston, but these building typologies provide an example of some more recent projects which is what we're hoping to get some of this. We're not going to get this throughout the whole area, but we're hoping we can get some of this, and hopefully that the regulations that go into place in terms of the reduction in required parking for these uses and the additional building height will incentivize some of this development. Let's see. And so how did they derive at these numbers here? So that they did some fit test studies, and they looked at some, different lot sizes and looked at the parking load, looked at the building footprint and the building typologies they're proposing, and laid those out on the site. So you can see on this site up here, and this is a pretty good size site where they have, a pretty tall ground floor building with another story on top of it. And this is how the parking requirement would be laid out. And obviously, when you jump up the site to a 3-acre site from a 2-acre site, you start to lay out that additional bank or two of parking that's required. And then that allows you to have that additional upper stories to subsidize what's proposed on the ground floor. We asked them to take the test fits a step further and look at some kind of more Norwalk specific examples of sites that could be redeveloped, and then also look at, on these sites, what would be the kind of, the benefits to the city from doing this, not just because we get rid of maybe a noxious use, but what do we get at in terms of the types of jobs that are created, the wages that are generated by those, and then taking that a step further, you can look at the tax impacts that the city might realize from that. And I think for some of the uses that are in these areas, there definitely will be an advantage going forward if we do get some of these developments. And obviously, Norwalk, while it's got its, locational advantages, we are in competition with a lot of other areas. So it's not like we're going to see a rush of these kind of projects going forward. And hopefully over time, we'll see more of this, and the area kind of transforms into a better area for the neighbors, as well as potentially adding jobs and adding to the grand list for the city. So looking specifically at the proposed zones, which we're going to get into in a little bit. So the I-1 zone is kind of no change in terms of some of the uses that are allowed. We are recommending removing self-storage. The I-2 zone, which is the kind of the lighter industrial zone, removes the ability to put in the earth moving contractor yards, which are kind of a nuisance to the neighborhoods, but does allow things like contractor office and so they can have their offices there and allow some outside parking of vehicles, provided they're well screened and not a nuisance to the neighborhood. And then in the areas which might be along the Route 1 or Route 2 corridor, Route 1 corridor, which are presently like the business 1 and business 2 zones, is recommending consolidating those zones and then allowing contractor offices, provided that they're kind of indoors and everything is housed indoors. And then where we have our, like our downtown core, which would be Central Business District, also South Norwalk, trying to introduce as often as possible those artisan uses when we can find them and get them in there.
Steve, is
Well,
redevelopment saying that there's, I know you just mentioned, we're in competition, but do you know of anything sort of in the works or people asking around in Norwalk specifically? And, if the zones just happen to be right, it would, flip the switch for them?
Yeah, there was actually, if you recall that project we approved on Wilson Avenue, that's been completed north of where the Grasso property was. There's a self-storage facility going in there now. Right after that kind of deal was closed, we kind of got wind of a manufacturer looking for, very interested in that space right after it was kind of already spoken for, so to speak. And that would have been something that would have been a significant job generator for the city. So there is interest in that. And that's kind of a market that's in demand right now. And we, our economic development staff does field a lot of those calls. So there is definitely a need for that in the market.
Gotcha.
Steve, also, do you think like maybe like creating it like an industrial park, like where the I-1 and I-2 zones would overlap? Would that help the city also?
That's a great point. I think we could get into that a little more where the maps come up. I think that the idea of that, as well as where you could see where the contractors could have like a something similar where you had space where like plumbing contractors, electricians, whomever could have rent out or lease space within a larger area. That, and that's where one area we'll get into is Martin Luther King Drive, which might open up some of that as well, which could pull some of that out of the residential areas overall, which I think would be a good thing. The table on the bottom just kind of lays out the recommendations in terms of where certain specific uses that have been identified as either areas of concern or areas that we want to highlight can go, and by what mechanism they can be approved. Just to highlight a couple that we've talked about already. So commercial vehicle and vehicle storage yards, they'd be allowed in I-1 by site plan or a special permit, depending on the size. But then you look at the next one down, which would be like where you have those heavy earth processing yards. And those only are recommended to be allowed in the I-1 zone. And again, would be either site plan or special permit, depending on the volume and size of what those are. Residential is one that came up a lot too, where we're recommending it be site plan approval in the business 1 and business 2 zone, not allowed at all in the I-1 zone, but allowed by site plan approval in the I-2 zone. And the last one I'll kind of highlight would be self-storage, which was identified as a concern. Oops, sorry about that. Identified as a concern throughout the process. And we haven't quite nailed down the language yet, but we think it's probably appropriate to allow those in the Route 1 corridor, maybe better to be allowed but not seen. So that's something that we're kind of thinking about how to, put into place, and not allowing them in the I-1 zone or the I-2 zone. So this will kind of get at some of the items we were just talking about. I think it's the area of the most significant change proposed is kind of the South Norwalk area, which kind of has the largest percentage of the industrial zone land. So the map on the left is the current zoning, just to flag some areas so we kind of get our bearings a little bit. Here's obviously Norwalk Harbor, here's Water Street. And this area through here, this darker purple, that's the existing I-1 zone. This is where you have kind of the heavy uses, where we think about LaJoy's, where you think about the Meadow Street yards, the transfer station, a lot of those big areas. On the west of there is Dr. Martin Luther King Drive. And this lighter, there's, I don't know, is periwinkle the right name? I'm not sure, but it's a lighter purple. That's kind of the restricted industrial zone now. And I think that's been a constant source of concern over time about what happens there and what doesn't happen there. Into the west on Boughton Street, there's also some heavy industrial 1 zone. So what's being proposed, and I just need to shrink your faces on my screen so I can see what I'm talking about. So what's being proposed is to shrink the I-1 zone area quite a bit. That's the dark purple over here. And the I-1 zone shrinks a lot on this side. Right now, I should have calculations by the end of the week on the changes in the square footage and also looking at those businesses I discussed. But so here's where my mouse would cooperate. Here's where the I-1 would be allowed. And instead of having the, here's Village Creek, and we've had so many conversations with those folks about impacts across the water. So what we think makes a transition is moving that heavy industrial to the west and keeping it and allowing it, because we understand that it's a need for the city to have these kind of uses, but then providing a transition from the residential areas to that lighter industrial zone. And completely eliminating the restricted industrial zone because it really doesn't play much of a purpose. One area I wanted to flag on the west side was the Rockland Road area. Right now, that's all restricted industrial. We're actually proposing to rezone it to the heavy industrial because it lines up with the uses that are there now. And to the west, there really aren't any neighborhood impacts that we have to worry about.
There's a rock crushing business, I think, out there too.
I think there is, yeah, there is one back through there. Boughton Street, we're proposing to rezone 2 different parts of it. So right now, this is the heavy I-1 zone to the north, and there's heavy I-1 to the south. The consultant team, when they were driving through, said Boughton Street is not a great street for this heavy truck traffic and recommended kind of down zoning that area. Through the middle piece through here, it's kind of a mishmash of uses, kind of like what we talked about, where there's residential next to commercial, next to residential to commercial. So we think it might make sense to rezone that to industrial to make it cohesive through that area and reduce those conflicts going forward. And I understand that there's, anytime you rezone property that one group may like it, one group may not like it, but I think what we're proposing, we think is more appropriate for the city over time. A couple other areas to highlight through here. Lexington Avenue, some of it right now is actually zoned neighborhood business. To the east of it's zoned industrial 1. The majority of this area in Lexington Avenue, I think the vast majority is all residential. So we don't think it's appropriate to keep it in the industrial zone or the neighborhood business, and would recommend rezoning it to C residential. This area through here is the San Vincenzo housing, and why it's zoned heavy industrial, I don't know. So we're proposing to rezone it to residential. When you get into some of the streets we were talking about, Kossuth and Olean and these areas, that's been a constant area of concern over time with residents. So we're trying to pull that heavy contractor use out of that area and either rezone it to residential or rezone it to the lighter commercial area. I want to flag one last thing on the map, and then I'll take any questions on this area. We inadvertently rezoned this area to residential when it should be neighborhood business. So we'll clean up the map right along Ely Street and upper part of Lexington when we do the final map, just to highlight that for you. And before I move on, does anybody have any questions about this area?
Do we have any way to help move some of the bigger trucks down the particular road you want them to go down?
One thing we kind of talked about, but it didn't go too far, was maybe there's a way to extend the street through here to bring the trucks out.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's tricky because the streets are all narrow and there's not a lot of vacant land to move things around. It's unfortunately it's the way it developed over time. Some of it.
Well, Boughton Street is one of those streets where that contract, a big contractor yard is still there, And the streets are very narrow, and I believe we have some new construction going on the street as well.
Correct on both accounts, yes.
Yeah, that'd be something I'd love for us just to consider as we move forward, if there's anything to help move the traffic in the particular way to on the right arteries or preventative measures. So, we don't have trucks all over the place potentially.
Yeah, one thing I think if MLK allows, if you rezone it and allows the smaller contractors like the plumbers and the HVAC guys and all those to operate in and out of here, I think that will pull some of this out of the residential areas and pull it away and onto the main boulevard.
Say, I have a question. What happened to the marine commercial zone?
Nothing right now. So we're going to just getting in depth on the waterfront study. So that will get a fresh look as part of that study. So no proposed changes at this time.
It's residential now. It's yellow.
So marine commercial is the red, and it's in this
Right,
map
but-
up here, it's area of further study.
Oh, okay. It looked like it was, I guess the difference in colors, it looks awfully much like the yellow. I see.
Yeah, that's this area up through here. So that's the area.
Okay.
Is the marine commercial the same as the marine conservation?
No, marine conservation are the islands out in the harbor or towards the south.
Oh, those aren't
It's-
island
it's like-
conservations.
Like my son-in-law's businesses there, big, they're wholesale fish, so it's a marine kind of use. There are boat yards there. Things that are sort of marine commercial, I guess. It used to be that you had to be marine commercial to get into that area. And it was an enterprise zone to encourage.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we've been having some really interesting discussions with all the business owners and property owners in that area about what they do, what's good for the area, what's bad for the area, what happens if we introduce different things into the area, because there's a demand to people to get at the waterfront. So yeah, I think that's going to have some pretty interesting recommendations to it. And this map just is a kind of blow up of some of those areas we were just talking about. We just because some of those streets are so tight when you get into Lebrano and those areas that we just wanted to highlight that and blow it up. And I think what we did was kind of right size the realignment of the boundaries to better fit the reality on the ground, and then also make sure we provide areas where we can have commercial businesses, but then reduce the conflicts where we're in proximity to those regular residential areas. Not a lot of change in this area. This is East Norwalk. It does recommend taking the existing I-1 spine, which runs east-west along the railroad tracks, and then putting it into that I-2 category. Another recommendation that it's just a flag for everybody is this parcel here is actually the DPW garage, whereas most of this is WPCA wastewater treatment plant. And this was identified in the East Norwalk TOD plan as well, is can we relocate that DPW garage to somewhere else in the city and then repurpose that property for something else? What that something else is, I have no idea at this point in time, but there's probably a better use for that land than storing plows and dump trucks and such. Moving to the north, we're off of Main Ave, Perry Ave area. So there's some legacy, industrial areas through here in heavier commercial businesses. So we're recommending rezoning these two areas from business 2 to the industrial 2. Last area is more of a cleanup area than anything else. When the West Ave Wall Street plan was done and the rezoning was done, there were several legacy industrial zone properties off of Wall Street area, and so also some neighborhood business that we just left alone, knowing we were going to do this study. But the more we looked at it, we just said, you know what, it's probably more appropriate just to rezone them all to the central business district from the I-1. And I think that over time, that'll add for more cohesive development throughout that area as well. So kind of a summary of what we talked about. There is a reduction in the amount of heavy industrial land, the I-1 land, which we think will reduce conflicts, but also still provide enough space for those uses to exist in the city. But removing the more noxious uses away from the residential areas and hopefully providing incentives for those properties to be repurposed into better uses, whether it's job creation, providing space for smaller contractors to operate. And then also looking at how do we define these contractor uses are. We understand what the differences are, but we need to codify them and make it clear. And then provide the future framework for development on the, whether it's the DPW garage, the Norton site, and then also looking at regulatory tools in terms of better screening requirements for these commercial uses when they butt up to residential areas. And then also different regulatory tools to protect the residential areas when these properties redevelopment. And we don't want the height to, loom over and take away from, from those properties. So moving through, we already the first bullet's already done. We're wrapping up the second bullet. We're taking public comment through November. And what I think would be the appropriate next steps beyond that is once the two commissions are combined, we'll put a amendment together to amend the plan of conservation development, similar to what we did for the East Norwalk TOD plan. At that point, we would amend the plan to include this study as part of that, and then work on the specific zoning to align with that. So that's kind of the next steps. And understanding that some of these uses did get moratoriums placed on them, and we'd like to get this zoning in place before those moratoriums expire, so that way everybody knows what the playing field it is going forward.
All right.
Any other
Any
questions?
final questions for Steve?
I have a question for Lou and Richard. Since you guys were also very close to us, what are some of the, I'm guessing Steve captured most things, but what's some of the more striking things you guys learned in that process?
Interesting question. I was surprised, frankly, of the role that the contractors' yards, especially the small yards for small contractors, play. One of the early conversations said that as some of the box stores disappear, should they disappear, on Connecticut Avenue, that at least temporarily some of those be moved there. That never made its way, and I think rightly so, into the final report. I also had a couple of conversations with a member of the Planning Commission who owns a small business, and he talked about the difficulty he had simply in parking the 3 or 4 vehicles that he owns for his small business. And that's it seemed to me a legitimate concern.
Because he didn't have parking on site, or?
Because he couldn't get parking where it was permitted.
Gotcha.
So I had to park illegally, got ticketed for it.
Gotcha. Oh, that's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
All right, Steve, maybe you can be a little quicker on the 2 status reports, the update of the zoning regs, and the South Norwalk TOD.
You don't want any other PowerPoint presentations? I think?
I think we've had enough for this evening.
No problem. So those will all be very quick because there's not a ton to report on either. So for the zoning regulations, the consultant's kind of in the slogging through process right now of starting to translate our old code into new code. So they're working on that. We talked about a meeting, but it makes sense to wait until there's a new commission formed to have that meeting with the group. So that'll happen after the new year. The South Norwalk study, they are actually finally making a little progress on that and have been working with the neighborhood group on some recommendations and some changes. So I don't know when the next meeting is on that, but that's kind of the status of that one.
Okay. We're almost at the end. Can I ask for approval of the minutes of our previous meeting, October 7th?
So move.
Okay, Michael moves and Galen seconds. Why don't we just do it with a show of hands? Marcella, you didn't make the last meeting. I don't think you can vote on this one. So 3, 4, 5 in favor and 1 abstention. Comments of the director?
Nothing further. Thank you.
Okay. And the only comment I'd make is, since not everyone who's here tonight was at our last meeting, I wanted to repeat that sometime between the election and January 1st, whoever the mayor is will have to appoint a new planning and zoning joint commission. And just to remind you, if you are interested in continuing to serve shortly after the election, and we know who the mayor will be, you should write a letter to the mayor indicating that you would like to be appointed to the new commission and continue your service to the city. Any other comments from commission members?
No.
All right, if not, I will entertain a motion to close the meeting and adjourn. People are not anxious to adjourn. Nick moves. Second, Michael. All those in favor, just show of hands. Seems to be unanimous.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Take care.
Good night,
See you
Gary.
all early in November.
Have a good night.
Good
So
night.